The story began in the abyss, a desert area with gullies and mountains. A huge monster with many teeth and eyes was growling. The main character, Kim Tae-yoon, rushed at this monster with a dagger. He climbed right into its mouth and tried to kill the monster. Blood was gushing out of its big mouth. The monster was screaming in pain, and Tae-hyun's hands began to shake. The monster was defeated. It fell next to him. He began to wipe the blood off his face and rested. He said with a tired look that he was finally able to kill the monster with his dagger. Suddenly, someone screamed, addressing him as if he were not awakened. He paid attention to this and looked in that direction. On a mountain of corpses stood a great team of awakened ones who were fighting various flying and huge monsters. One of the awakened ones screamed, "What is he doing at all? Since he went as a porter, then let him work normally, collect drops." Another shouted at him, "Is he completely blind? Does he not see corpses? Or does he think they hired him for nothing?" Tae-hyun looked at them guiltily and apologized. The awakened one moved into battle again and said how useless the porters had become. He exhaled and cursed. The world had changed after the opening of the abyss. The abyss was another dimension where monsters that only existed in fantasy actually lived. After the opening of the abyss, extraordinary powers awakened in people, and with them, humanity began to destroy monsters and conquer the abyss. Because of all this, people were now judged not by their decency or efforts, but by their awakening rank. If you had a high rank, then a good life was guaranteed for you. Tae-hyun cut up monsters and took crystals out of them. He thought that, however, he was very lucky. He was just a porter carrying the things of the awakened ones and had not managed to awaken at the age of 35. Until he awakens, he will not be able to live their life. He turned towards them and shouted that he had collected all the loot there. But suddenly he noticed that the entire awakened team was dead. Their weapons were lying on the ground next to a pile of their corpses. They were all broken, defeated in their own blood. He was very scared of this, asked, "What?" They were all dead. He was the last one left. A huge monster appeared behind him, which scared him very much. It was a SSS-Rank monster named Asmodeus. Tae grabbed his dagger and flew at him with an attack, but the creature put many of its hands in front of him. The protagonist's hand was separated into two parts without the enemy touching. He grabbed his remaining limb and began to scream in pain. Rage appeared in his eyes. He turned to Asmodeus and screamed furiously, "What?" But suddenly this monster released lightning from its hands, which shot straight into his forehead. Tae-hyun couldn't move, and his forehead started to bleed non-stop. He thought, "What kind of death is this?" He wasn't bleeding, he was looking straight into the monster's eyes and crying. He thought, his parents died in a car accident. He was bullied at school. And here he was ignored for the rest of his life, because he was not awakened. Yet he was going to die like this as a porter? He was a real loser with his worthless life. He cursed awakening. Tae-hyun writhed in pain, and his blood continued to flow out. A majestic voice sounded, that all the conditions for awakening were met. At that moment, the protagonist found himself in front of a golden staircase, on top of which stood a great deity. He looked and could not understand what was happening at all. The divine being was watching him. He began to spin around and asked, what was going on here? Was he really? He remembered how he sat in front of Asmodeus and accepted his death. He thought, did this monster stop? The deity came down the stairs and asked, laughing, was he surprised that someone like Asmodeus stopped? Tae turned to him and asked with fear in his eyes, what or who is this? The deity said that who knows, someone is calling him king. But let him not worry about it. He must grant him power. He thought it was a king. What power? What is he even talking about? Was it he who stopped Asmodeus? The deity showed many planets and galaxies in front of him. Tae was very surprised by this. He did not know what to think. The deity said that, however, it would be better if he thought that such a miracle would not happen again. He screamed for it to wait. Why did it choose him? And what is going on here anyway? The deity just laughed and said that he should just wait patiently for the moment. The day will come when he will understand everything. Then they will meet again. Suddenly, everything around him started to glow, making him confused about what was going to happen next. A huge monster was flying straight at them from above. The deity said that this was his key. Tae grabbed it and everything started to sparkle, making it impossible to see anything. After a very bright light, there was complete darkness. He started to hear some voices and thought, was that voice? Baehashu said that this loser was still sleeping. He was crazy for ignoring them. Then he needed to be woken up. Tenhei started to open his eyes and saw a hand in front of him trying to hit him. Hyunsu wished him good morning and hit him on the cheek. He screamed, was he awake now? The protagonist was trying to understand everything and come to his senses. Hyunsu laughed and said that he only listens if he was hit. Tenhei suddenly recognized and thought, how did that high school bully get here? The other two classmates laughed at him. Hyunsu hit him again and asked why he was silent. He thought that he had just been in the abyss. He tried to remember, and the word power sounded in his head. Suddenly, a system window with his characteristics opened in front of his eyes. It said that he was currently 19 years old, he had the skills of an F-rank predator. He thought this was a status window. He went back 16 years? If so, then this means… Tenhei began to laugh hysterically while he was holding him by the collar. Hyunsu did not understand his reaction at all. He asked very loudly, what was wrong with this crazy guy? Has he completely lost his mind? Everyone continued laughing. He shouted insults at him, and then said that he was asking for it himself. But at that moment, Tenhei's fist flew at him. He hit him with all his strength, causing him to fly several meters away. His classmates did not expect such an outcome and began to panic. The protagonist began to smile and thought that this meant that he was also awakened. Hyunsu's classmates began to stare at Tenhei, who wiped his face. One of them activated fire in his hand and ran at him. He called him names and shouted that he was completely crazy. Who the hell is he? Tenhei was able to dodge his fire attack and punched him in the chin with his fist. Another classmate began to throw ice shards at him, but the protagonist was able to kick him in the stomach. He thought that for 35 years, during his entire awakened life, he did everything he could. From physical training, to learning all the information about the abyss and its monsters, and also collecting data on various skills. Even fighting skills, so there was no way he would lose to some bullies who didn't even know the most basic basics. They stood up again and ran at him with an attack, but Tenhei again kicked them all away with one punch. The two students were lying on the concrete and trying to come to their senses. Tenhei laughed tiredly and said that of course he would need to train again. He stretched his arms, then turned around and asked what was going on. Hyunsu came to his senses and started to get up. He asked since when did he become awakened? He started to transform completely into a stone body and said that now he would definitely become a corpse. A system window popped up that this was a stone skin under the C-rank. It strengthens the body with stone growths. Hyunsu aimed his fist at the protagonist and tried to hit him, but he was able to dodge several of his blows. Tenhei suddenly noticed that he wanted to attack him from above, which caused a drop of sweat to fall from his face. He became wary and waited. Hyunsu struck, which caused dust and many stones to fly around. He stood up and thought that he had already won. But Tenhei appeared behind him. He turned around and caught his fist on his stone face. The protagonist looked at him questioningly, because his fist started bleeding from his face. He asked how he was doing? He thought that he only hurt himself. Hyunsu hit him in the solar plexus, causing him to fly back several meters. Tenhei flew across the concrete and hit a pile of rocks. There was a lot of blood on his face, after which he tried to come to his senses. Hyunsu began to approach him and laugh. He said that he should have known his limits as an actor. He asked that he finally came to his senses? He was a worthless, unawakened fool. What will he do now? Run away again? Or continue to try with his awakened skills? Tenhei thought that all awakened ones receive a skill and a rank. Starting from F rank, when they are almost no different from an ordinary person, ending with C rank, when you are worthy of being called a monster. The physical abilities and skills of awakened ones grow exponentially. But he got an unknown skill, and also the worst rank. There is no way he can handle Hyunsu, who has a C rank. But for some reason, he did not feel that he would lose. Tenhyun felt a surge of energy in himself. A dark and strong energy began to emanate from his body, which filled him with strength. Hyunsu was very surprised at what he saw and shouted, "What is this happening here? It can't be! He really awakened? He is a non-entity?" Tenhyun majestically stood up from his place and thought that this is a predator? He feels like magic is listening to him. Hyunsu shouted that he does not understand what is happening. The protagonist's eyes turned red. Hyunsu ran at him again with an attack and swung his stone hand at him. He shouted that everything will end, and if he kills the magic caster. He filled himself with dark strong energy, then put his hand in front of himself. When Hyunsu ran up to him, a powerful stream of energy pushed him away and practically tore stone after stone from his body. He looked at his opponent with fear in his eyes and did not understand what was happening. Ten-hyun ominously held his hand in front of him and emitted very strong energy. His opponent screamed and grunted in pain while all the stones flew off his body. At the same time, the students inside the building did not suspect anything at all. But behind them, on the roof of the building, a very powerful and large whirlpool of dark red energy was created. Ten-hyun, who had recently emitted a huge stream of energy, began to weaken it. Hyunsu fell in front of him on the concrete, without a single stone on his body and unconscious. A system window with information popped up. Devouring completed. As a result of absorbing the target, his rank changed to E-rank. Stone tendrils began to appear on his hand. A system window popped up. That he received a new skill stone skin, which was just registered. After some time, in the medical center, there was a young nurse sitting in the office. The protagonist had dragged all 3 of his defeated opponents on his back. He greeted her. The nurse saw this and screamed in fear. What was this? Ten-hyun thought that after the fight, he brought the students, including Hyunsu, to the infirmary. The nurse had treated him with her healing skills. Of course, he had to lie to her. When she asked how they all got hurt, he told her that they had rolled down the stairs. He managed to persuade her to continue without asking any questions. Now he was completely healthy. And that was great, he had awakened, and he had also had a ride with an old enemy. But the problem was that he now had a predator. His rank, which he had not been able to raise by training all his past life, was able to change after the first fight. It may be an F-rank skill, but his strength is like that of an S-rank. He can even absorb other people's skills. Why did this guy, the king, give him such strength? Why did he regress him? So many questions, but in the end he was left with only one. Learn more about his predator skill. Ten-hyun returned home after the medical center and said that he had not been home for a long time. He thought that when his parents died, he stayed with his uncle. He passed his apartment and asked if his uncle would be late. Maybe he would have time to look for information about similar skills. But after he entered the apartment, he noticed something was wrong. A picture opened before his eyes that 3 bandits were sitting over Hwang Jang. He was counting money. He was very scared and screamed, "What is Ten-hyun doing here?" He also did not understand anything and screamed, "Why is he not at school?" Suddenly it dawned on him, and he saw the scattered money. He thought that this little bastard. He remembers that before his regression, he wanted to make friends with other bandits, so he took all the money from the house and got into trouble. The bandits began to hesitate and asked who it was. Then he tried to justify himself to them. Tension thought that who would have thought that this happened today? The bandit asked, admiringly. He was interested in who it was, but it turned out that it was his cousin? He approached him and said that if he did not want to get it, then he should forget and get lost. They would take what they needed and leave. The unawakened elder. The bandit patted the protagonist on the head. Tension looked at him carefully and smiled. He said that this was a great excuse, he just wanted to test. The bandit did not understand anything and asked what was happening. Suddenly a powerful punch hit the bandit's head, causing him to fall to the floor. The other bandits saw this and got into fighting stances. Everyone was very surprised by this outcome. Tension again prepared his fist and wanted to hit again, but the bandit screamed in panic for him to stop. He screamed for his predator to activate. But after that, nothing changed. A system window popped up in front of him, saying that the predator function was unavailable. The bandit looked at him questioningly. Tenhen began to panic because his skill did not activate. The bandit began to get angry and screamed that he was a crazy fool. He punched him in the face with all his might, causing the protagonist to fall to the floor. The bandit screamed for him to die. Another bandit activated his awakened skill. He put his hands in front of him and released C-rank chains from his hands. Another bandit activated a C-rank poison skill. He released it from his mouth. The bandit leader released his hissing vines from his hand, causing C-rank bleeding. Tenhen stood up and saw the skills of these awakened ones flying at him, after which sweat began to roll down his face. All the attacks collided, after which a terrifying noise thundered. The bandits watched this. They were waiting to see what would happen next. The bandit leader asked how the unawakened dared to pretend to be awakened. He doesn't know his place at all. But suddenly he noticed something and was surprised. A system window popped up that the use of skills was detected. Chain, poison, bleeding skills were confirmed. Tenhen was filled with this energy. A system window popped up that due to the mystical power, resistance was received. Tenhen's hand turned to stone, he asked, suddenly it didn't work, and then neutralized the skills? The bandit was scared and said that he didn't know what was going on. Tenhen activated his stone hand and hit the bandit with all his might. His eyes were covered with cold rage. The bandit lost several teeth after the blow and said that he was terribly strong. Tenhen defeated all the bandits and said that he now knew two things. The status window is only visible to awakened ones. It displays information about the awakened one, but not all. First, there was no shortage of mana, but the predator still did not activate. In 2 words, in addition to what is written, there is something in the activation conditions other than mana. In addition, the passive effect of the predator is not indicated in the description. It neutralizes all negative effects such as bleeding or poison. He thought that gradually he would be able to confirm his assumptions. And more importantly, what is Huang doing? He fell on his knees in front of him and screamed emotionally that the elder, seeing this incredible side of him, his cousin, will repent for what he did. Let him definitely forgive him. Tenhyun was very surprised by this, but decided to remain silent. He said that he was ready to lick shoes or bark, he will do whatever he says. The protagonist thought that he was so pathetic. He knew that he was a fox, but to this extent? However, the problem was not in him. Huang began to bark in front of him. Tenhyun thought that the problem was what was about to happen. He said that he would forgive him. Huang was surprised and asked if that was true. He said that in exchange for forgiveness, he would go with him. He did not understand why he said that and for what purpose. After a while, in front of a sign that said that this was a forbidden area, that only authorized persons could enter. The leader of the organization stood with his subordinates in front of the gate. The worker asked if this was a gate breakthrough. Many monsters were standing in front of them and trying to get out. A gate breakthrough is a phenomenon when a path out of the abyss suddenly opens for monsters. If nothing is done, everything can develop into a dungeon disaster. The leader confidently said that it had been 10 years since the last disaster. That time, a gate suddenly appeared and the monsters began to crawl away. The worker said that given the monsters, if they did nothing, the disaster would only be a few moments away. The worker shouted that maybe they should evacuate the nearby areas. The leader said that they didn't need to do that because they had his skill, a B-rank barrier. He turned to his subordinates and confidently said that, in addition, the rank of these enemies was only C-rank. Which meant that the strongest monster that could come out of there was also C-rank. At that moment, the monsters tried their best to break through this barrier, which caused the defense to crack. The monsters roared with all their might and tried to break the barrier. The leader said that, in other words, even if an unexpected crisis occurred, the barrier broke, and the beasts that were imprisoned there broke free. The workers began to call out to their leader and warn him of the danger. He turned around and saw a one-eyed monster with a long tongue running towards him. He decapitated several monsters with his punches and kicks. He said that as B-rank they would be able to hold back the breakthrough. At the same time, Huang and Tenhyun ran up to the place. Huang shouted at him that shouldn't everything be fine, that he shouldn't call him that. He was right. The mana of this gate was originally at the C-rank level. And the staff that arrived there were B-ranked, so a monster of that rank was no obstacle. Huang pointed his finger and shouted that he knew it. Tenhyun said that only if this was actually a C-ranked gate. He was very surprised at what he saw. In front of them was a mountain of monster corpses. The leader was sitting in front of the corpses. He thought that it was so strange, these low-ranking monsters were able to break through his B-rank barrier? It couldn't be that the mana coming out of there was a rank higher than his? The worker shouted that there was something inside. They all noticed how monster after monster was crawling out of the barrier. More and more monsters were trying to break out. There was a very large monster inside the barrier. The team looked at it and was very scared. And this monster screamed at the top of its lungs, causing the remaining barrier to split. The leader was very surprised and could not believe it. Many monsters of different sizes were released. The team began to panic. Among the monsters was an A-rank giant ogre. Sweat began to roll down the leader's face, and he said that this was not a C-rank, but an A-rank? Something exploded very loudly next to them, then exploded again. Huang screamed that his interlocutor was right, but this could be stupid. How did he know all this? Tenhyun thought, because he had already been through this. He screamed that there was no one here, that there were no monsters, they did not even evacuate the areas. He said that he trusted his intuition. He asked how he could trust it so easily. He replied that his intuition told him so. Huang screamed that he was just lying to him. He really hoped that he wasn't deceiving him. When they almost reached the place, such a picture opened up in front of him. Many people were running straight at them, and behind these people were monsters of different sizes and with different weapons. The girl who ran first screamed for them all to run. The gate had been broken. People were screaming in panic. They were asking for help. Huang saw all this and began to panic very much. Tenhyun asked if he remembered what he told him to do. So let him start right now. He asked what he would do at that moment. He replied that he would deal with this abomination and would be there. He activated the stone body skill and went to meet the monsters. Around the same time, in the largest building in the city, in the headquarters, Go Taiwook stood by the huge panoramic window and observed the situation. He said that, as he said, the situation is quickly escalating. The C-rank gate breakthrough turned out to be A rank. It is impossible to send reinforcements since the others are busy in the dungeons or exploring the abyss. Right now, the only solutions to the crisis are the awakened A rank. And Hyunsu was standing behind him. He turned to him and shouted that he was their only hope. Let him help them. Blade of Madness. He is an awakened A rank with the Blade of Madness skill. Hyunsu stood there with a mad look, tears streaming from his eyes, and he shouted for those fighting there to hold on a little longer. He is already on his way to them. His specialty is 8th grade syndrome. The protagonist fought with monsters. He hit all the monsters that came his way with his stone fist. He moved quickly and tried to find an even more insidious approach. The monsters fell one after another into a pile of corpses. He also activated his predator skill, which smashed the monsters into many particles. He thought that the predator did not work then because of fatigue. A system window popped up with information that fatigue is 52%. He thought that if it exceeds 70%, the skill will not activate. Most skills use mana. But this does not mean that you need to worry only about it. Because there is fatigue. It increases if you use skills or move, and the higher the fatigue, the more the power of skills decreases and the heavier the body becomes. He regrets, of course, that he needs to think about so much, but he thought that he can absorb the body of monsters, thereby restoring mana without spending it. A system window popped up with information that the target's life activity has stopped. Mana will not be spent. He succeeded in hunting and restored his mana. He thought that it was even better that his skill was increased to D, and also increased his predator ability and stone skin. The more he uses predator, the stronger he becomes. At this rate, he could become a C rank, or even a SS rank. Or maybe he could become the first SS rank. He defeated the monsters in the area and said that the job was done and that he should return to his cousin. He turned around and noticed that a monster was flying towards him along with the hero. Hyunsu was fighting a high-ranking monster and shouting that he was a dirty monster. He would avenge the souls of the dead. He cried and shouted that this warrior of justice would judge him. The protagonist looked at this and was indignant. That huge monster swung at Hyunsu with a terrifying roar. He readied his weapon and dealt 1,000 blows to his opponent. A powerful explosion occurred in the area, causing a strong wind to blow and a wave of force to pass through. Tenhyun stood nearby and was completely shocked by what was happening. He thought that he had easily defeated an A-rank monster. This must be the awakened A-rank who allowed the gate to be broken through in his past life. Blade of Madness. Hyunsu stood over the defeated monster, and his blade was stuck in the enemy's body. He thought that the hero was as strong as everyone said. Hyunsu laughed and winked at him, and then he said that the stupid monster died from his sword of justice. Tenhyun thought that he was stupid enough, but why was he here? Yes, his regression. He was fighting an ogre in another part of the city. Hyunsu folded his hands in front of himself and said that a resident of this city, a silent plea, he hoped that they would be in peace. A system window popped up in front of the protagonist, which felt like the use of a skill. He looked closely and paid attention to it. But suddenly he noticed that someone appeared behind Hyunsu and stabbed his sword through him. He screamed that he did not understand at all what was happening. Blood flowed from him. The one who defeated him began to gloat and said that he had finally found the right hero. The entire city was covered in dust and smoke from the explosions. Around the same time, Huang was standing in a secluded place in front of a sick girl. He looked at her and thought, is this really normal? After all, many people will die today. He remembered his cousin's words. Tenhyun said that one of them was their school nurse, Choi Naeon. She would die because she would help others instead of evacuating. Could he put people to sleep with his sleep skill, right? Huang was shocked, but tried to squeeze out agreement. He said that then he should put her to sleep and evacuate her. He would deal with everyone else. Huang wondered, how did the elder know about all this? Or maybe? But it makes sense? There is no other way to explain it. He was definitely awakened by the foresight skill. But that can't be. After all, foresight is really cool. Even though he denied it, it was crazy. But anyway, how could anything go wrong? After some time on the battlefield, Tenhyun thought that something was definitely wrong. He watched the hero and the one who went against him. Hyunsu grabbed his wound and went to meet his opponent. He shouted, "Who is he? Let him reveal himself." He laughed and said that he was alive even with his vital organs punctured. This is very surprising. After all, A ranks are completely different. He was very surprised by his opponent's speech. He said that it would only make him happier. He turned out to be a B rank villain named Han Sando. His skill was stealth. This awakened one who committed a crime automatically becomes a villain. Han is in cahoots with all the villains, because he is one of them. He is a murderous maniac who killed people for his own pleasure during the breakthrough. Tenhyun thought that he was sure that they had never met in their past life. Does that mean that the future changed because of him? Hyunsu got really angry and shouted that he was a malicious fool. Such a villain too. He would punish him with his own hands. At that moment, he took out his blade and swung his attack at him. He did not have time to run to his opponent, as everything under his feet began to tremble. He was surprised by this, as well as his opponent. Suddenly, the monster that he had defeated earlier began to move. Everyone was very surprised by this. The monster roared with great anger. Hyunsu began to fall and screamed, but how did he survive? Han also began to fall and screamed, grinning that this monster had incredible regeneration. As expected from an A-rank monster, the monster regained all its strength, after which it stood up and began to swing its fist at those two. It struck the ground, causing everyone around to fly in different directions. Han fell to the side and said, laughing, that it can't be helped. Perhaps they will assign this hero to this freak. He turned around and said that in any case they have an observer here. He began to scream madly that this is great. The more victims, the better for him. He licked his weapon and rushed at him with mad strength. Han was filled with madness and screamed for him to die right now. He armed himself with 2 daggers and attacked Tenshin. When the dagger touched his body, it hit a stone shell. The protagonist only laughed at him and called him names. He kicked him in the face with his foot and confidently watched him fall. Han laughed and also began to call him names. He screamed that he must be awakened too. He got to his feet and prepared to deliver the next blow. Tenshin said that he was a B-rank villain named Han. He is a psycho who loves to kill using his stealth skill. Isn't it him? He is so glad that they finally met. The protagonist activated the stone shell on his body and began to challenge him to a fight with a wide smile on his face. Han struck the stone hands, alternating hands with weapons. Tenhyun carefully watched his opponent's techniques and tried to outplay him. He defended himself, and then attacked. They circled and moved somewhere forward. Han stopped and said, laughing, that he was quite skilled to be confident in himself. Who would have known that blades would not work on him? He also stopped in a defensive pose and watched. In their background, Hyunsu was fighting that huge monster. Han said that he probably thought he had a chance, since his attacks did not work on him. However, let him know that it is worth understanding that the world does not follow plans. Tenhyun was very wary of his words and was ready for new defense methods. He looked at him with a crazy look and disappeared into thin air. Tenhyun thought that he used stealth. So, in the end, he used it? But he knows that it won't change the fact that his attacks don't affect him. He felt a strong aura appear next to him, and he turned around, striking in that direction. Khan appeared behind him and asked if he was sure of his words. The protagonist was very surprised, after which he struck and damaged the stone hand. Blood flowed from his hand. He thought he was bleeding? Khan swung at him again and laughed hysterically. He shouted that he even knew how many of his kind he had killed. They were stupid, believing that their skills were invincible. Khan moved very quickly. He moved in a circle and shouted while striking, that when they realize that they are weak, they immediately lose and die from the desire to escape, right? Let him better understand one thing before he dies. Tenhyun tried his best to protect himself from his attacks. He shouted that all skills have a weakness. He struck many times again and managed to pierce the protagonist's stone skin, causing him to fall. There was blood all around him. He tried to catch his breath and come to his senses. He thought that who knew that stone skin had such a flaw? Stone skin does not block a blow completely. It breaks the stone unbearably, and the destroyed part is replaced by a stone with significantly reduced durability. He had been trying to achieve this from the very beginning, but now he is absolutely sure that he can withstand a one-on-one fight against a B rank, because his physical abilities are much higher than the average D rank. They stood and looked at each other angrily. Tenhyun asked, "It seems like we should finish the tests?" Khan was surprised by his question, then laughed hysterically and shouted that he was driven into a dead end, and he had gone crazy? He ran at him again with his daggers. He asked the B-rank villain if he knew why he wanted to meet him. Han laughed and shouted, "What is he yapping about?" The protagonist activated the Predator skill and said with an ominous look that he wanted to take his skill. Red dark energy began to swirl around him. Han was scared and thought, "What kind of evil mana is this? This fool hid it all this time?" Dark energy began to catch up with him. He laughed and called him names, after which he went into a slight invisibility, and shouted that he did not know what this skill was. But he thinks, will he be able to hit him without seeing? He began to circle around him, and tried to dodge the dark energy. Tenhyun tried to catch his dark energy, and said that didn't he himself say that all skills have weaknesses? He realized this when he absorbed monsters. Some of them constantly left his field of vision. But in the end, the Predator caught up with everyone. To put it simply, wherever he hid, wherever he ran, the Predator would catch him no matter what. He began to panic because he felt that dark energy was catching up with him. He screamed in fear, after which his weapon and ring flew in different directions, because he was defeated. After some time, the sun was shining in the city, and Hyunsu was lying among the ruins. He thought that if it were not for that villain, then the hero of justice, the invincible warrior, even he could not defeat death. His face was covered in blood, a huge monster with 4 eyes was walking towards him, and he could not gather his strength and passed out. A high-ranking monster approached and hit him with his fist with all his might, and then struck him several more times, growling menacingly. He continued to growl at his enemy, but then he noticed that there was no body at the place of the blows. Tenhyun was standing behind him. He asked why exactly like that. He sprawled on the ground. Although this is not surprising. He went invisible and took that hero to save him. He held him by the scruff of the neck and said that it was much easier that way. After a while, Tenhyun and Hwang stood in front of the entrance to the apartment. His worried parents were standing there, screaming in surprise. Hwang joyfully screamed that he was finally home. Tenhyun looked at them guiltily. He asked him if everything was okay. The boy's parents stood and cried. They screamed that they thought that monsters had defeated them. He laughed and said that nothing like that had happened, because they were with their cousin. The parents screamed that maybe nothing had happened to them, because they were not at home, but the room was such a mess, as if someone had turned the whole house upside down. He guiltily began to justify himself that nothing had happened. Was that true? He was looking for salvation in his cousin's eyes. Tenhyun laughed guiltily and said that it was hard to say. After a while, breaking news was heard on phones and TV channels. According to the government statements, the current threat of a breakthrough has been completely eliminated. Considering the possibility of another breakthrough, the government ordered nearby schools to close for a week. Also, the survivors have begun to recover successfully, and the public can breathe a sigh of relief. The leader was in the hospital on N4 with his team. He kept repeating that he was not a C rank, but an A rank. The nurse from that school was also alive. She stood in front of the security personnel and told them in a panic that when she fell asleep, she was already here. Hyunsu was also in the hospital, surrounded by cameras and microphones, screaming in panic that his dear residents were deceived. It was not he who defeated the giant ogre. The real hero is another person. The news said that, however, since the corpse of the giant ogre was not found and the identity of the villain who attacked the people was truly unknown, people were worried that the security measures might be insufficient. The following news also began to be announced. Tenhyun locked his phone and said that this was great. Thank goodness there was no word about him. Then he needed to proceed to the next step. He stood on the abandoned rails in front of the dark tunnel. A system window popped up in front of him with his stats and skills. He now had 3 skills. D-rank stealth hides his body, affects 5 mana. Obtaining stealth was especially fortunate, but at his current level, it was too difficult to use all 3 skills at once. Because stupidly using them, he would use up all his mana, and also increase the fatigue level, and everything would end up quite pitifully. He thought that a better solution would be a potion. Potion elixirs created for various purposes, such as restoring malnutrition or fatigue. But they are quite expensive, so you need to earn money, but to hunt you need an official permit. He entered an abandoned tunnel and found a huge hole inside, from which a purple light came out. He began to crawl into this gap. He thought that in fact, even simply using skills without such a permit is considered illegal. His little cousin knew about it. So he only has one thing left to do, to protect the unexplored dungeon. Through this gap, he entered a dungeon with many monsters. The monsters shouted and discussed him. How could a pathetic mortal come there? How did he find them? They laughed and shouted that they should paralyze him and have a feast. Tenhyun was surprised and asked, "Do they speak well, highly evolved monsters?" A system window popped up, that these are B-rank spider sisters. He said that a B-rank wouldn't be enough to change his rank. Would he have to kill hundreds of them? The spiders ran at him and screamed at him. How dare he, a small man? He still didn't understand what situation he was in. One of the spiders gathered energy in her cheeks and spat a huge piece of web at the protagonist, and screamed that they would eat him alive. They laughed and screamed, but what about him now? He felt his body filling up and the time was coming. He activated his predator skill, and a system window popped up that, thanks to mystical power, resistance was enabled. Tenhyun said with a confident face that, as he thought, they had a useful skill. They were very surprised by this and scared. They began to scream for him to wait. Screams of pain and pitiful cries for help began to come from the dark tunnel. A system window popped up that he had succeeded in hunting. He had received a new skill, paralysis, which was already registered. After some time, in the new South Korean Players Association, there were 2 guards standing in front of the entrance to the building, and there were 3 people inside, 2 of whom were sitting at a table. Go Tae-wook, who was the deputy manager, the personnel officer of the new South Korean Players Association, stood in front of them and thought that in front of him were 2 of the best players of the association. A player is an awakened one who is allowed to use his skills for various purposes, such as exploring the abyss, clearing dungeons, and so on. Currently, there are 5 centers of such players in South Korea. The largest Korean guilds, the 4 great guilds. Fighters are indivisible. Masters are alchemists. Mages are wizards. Informants are night wanderers. And the authorized agency that manages the players includes the 4 great guilds, the new South Korean Players Association. And right in front of him, they were sitting. Yu Ah-young is the head of the Night Wanderer Guild and a C-rank player. She looked at him and said that they have not seen each other for a long time. Ji Jinhui is the chairman of the South Korean Players Association and a C-rank player. He thanked her and said it was great that she came. He knew she was busy. Did she learn anything new? She asked. Did he mean about the guild and the villain? The Villain Guild is a criminal organization founded by the most reckless, even among villains. The members of this guild wear gold rings with 3 skulls. She handed him the papers and said that here are their latest movements, as well as a list of the players they are targeting. He was very happy and took the papers. She said that she was sure he did not call her to personally hand over the documents. So why did he call her? Ji looked up from the papers and looked at her. He laughed and asked if she knew. He wanted to know her opinion. Yu-young was surprised and asked her opinion on what? He seriously asked when they passed the player test? She started to worry and said that of course, when she reached the age of such qualification, at 19 years old. She looked at him very surprised and told the chairman not to say that something was wrong. He smiled and asked, "What do you think? A high school student can fight a monster?" Around the same time, in that same hidden dungeon, Tenhyun was sitting on a pile of corpses, and his backpack was filled with various diamonds. He picked up the phone and asked, "Is this one of the 4 great guilds, alchemists?" He said that the thing is that he wants to buy some potion. After some time, the 7-day school closure and breakthrough ended. What happened during these 7 days? Tenhyun and Hwang were studying in the steam room and pumping up their stamina along with strength. They were undergoing intensive training. Also, the main character was cleaning the dungeon. In one of the 4 largest guilds, an alchemist. Tenhyun brought the leader of his team all his magic stones. He screamed, "How many magic stones are there?" He will take him to the VIP, or better yet, to the SVIP. They will make a deal with the alchemist. He stocked up on potions. Hwang said that the mana stone, it is a stone that acts like a monster's heart, used to make potions with equipment. Tenhyun thought, and he also raised his rank and all his skills to level C. Despite this, there is still a long way to go, but well, he must go to school. His classmates pounced on him and looked at him carefully. One of them said that there were rumors that he single-handedly wiped out Hyunse's henchmen. So he hasn't awakened? Whatever happened, he is in big trouble. She asked the other why? He asked, does he really not know? It got to the point that 3 schoolchildren were walking down the corridor. Tenhyun noticed this and looked in that direction. Chairs and desks scattered in the classroom, and the other students pushed them aside and tried not to interfere with fear in their eyes. Lee Jong-jae entered the classroom and sat in front of his rival, putting his feet up on the port. Classmates whispered that this man would not leave everything like this. Lee said with a confident face that they had not seen each other for a long time. Tenhyun thought that he was an awakened S-Rank. The leader of the Gang Daesan Middle School, the third-generation Chaebol Daesan Group, a large corporation that sponsors Daesan Middle School. And also, most importantly, the culprit who set Bae Hyun-soo on him, just because he was not awakened. Tenhyun asked why he called him that. He couldn't help but laugh quietly. He raised his face and menacingly told him to stop talking nonsense and get lost. Lee's subordinates were shocked by his intonation. One of them began to call him names. He shouted that how dare he? After which Lee punched him so that he wouldn't bother him. He stood up and asked if he couldn't see that he was busy talking. He fell down, and his nose started bleeding. The protagonist watched what was happening carefully. Lee turned around and said, smiling, that he knew that after defeating Bae Hyun-soo, she was very inspired. But is it necessary to tease the opponent by looking at his face? He activated the fire energy next to him and looked menacingly. Everything around was burning and very hot. Tenhyun thought that this was the magical power of an awakened C-Rank? The power is simply off the charts. Lee said that he was paying attention when he was told important things. He kept his hand ready in the pocket of his pants, and wondered what it would be like to meet a predator. Lim Yang joined their conversation. She told him to calm down and remember that everything in moderation. She wanted him to leave. She approached his subordinates, froze their hands with her magic, causing them to scream. The protagonist recognized her. She told him not to make things up either and to stop. He smiled nervously and thought that she was the class monitor, a very rich girl, Uae Yun's half-sister. Her class was a C-Rank awakening. She was the most promising model student, a future SS-Rank player. She had so many nicknames, there would be more names, but when there were problems, it was simply impossible to retreat directly and dirty. She stood and glared at Lee. He looked at her and asked, smiling, to leave her alone? Some kind of misunderstanding had occurred. He laughed and said that this was just a conversation between friends. She asked if they were really friends. Did he just punch him? He glared at her and asked her not to cross the line. She confidently said that if he did not leave on his own, she would help him. Let him drop everything and go away. He stood with fiery energy, and she was icy. Tenhyun looked at their confrontation and thought that maybe they should really leave everything? Otherwise, if they continue, the class will be in danger of being routed. Suddenly, Lee turns around and says as he leaves that he is giving up everything, he is not going to just fight her. But then his hand began to burn, and he turned around, saying an important information that she probably really thought he would say that. He swung at her with a fireball in his hands. She had already prepared her hands to freeze him, but an unpleasant and warning signal sounded through the loudspeaker. The protagonist was just waiting for what they would say. The loudspeaker said that this was the broadcasting department speaking. The Players Association will hold a special lecture in the main hall. All students must immediately gather in the main hall. And from now on, the Players Association will also receive. Lee stood with fire in his hands and asked, "What is this, the Players Association?" He lowered his head and looked closely at Lim Ae-yun, who was also standing ready with her attack. He smiled and said that they were on time as always. Let them consider themselves lucky. He walked out of the classroom and called his subordinates to follow him. She made sure that he left and turned to the protagonist. She asked if he was okay. He did not have to thank her. After which, she turned around and saw that he was not on that chair. She did not understand where he went. Tenhyun was already standing at the entrance and asked why she was standing and what she was waiting for. Didn't she hear the announcement about the gathering in the main hall? Then he will go first. She was very surprised by his speed, did not understand why she did not notice him. She wondered if he was always like this. After a while, at the gathering place for all the students, a lot of students had gathered and were standing in a line near the podium. They were discussing that this was a special lecture organized by the Players Association. I wonder what it will be about. Isn't it because of the gate break? Go Taewook came to the podium, checked the sound and greeted everyone. He introduced himself as the Deputy Director of Personnel of the Players Association and gave his name, He said that there were two reasons why he had gathered them here. One was the lack of response to the gate breach, an apology and safety training from the Players Association. The other reason was that for all of them who were responsible for the future of their new career, we were informing them of the changes to the players' exam at this time. Lee stood and called the protagonist's names. Lim A-Yun stood and also thought about him, that she would need to find out more about him later. Ten-hyun, meanwhile, stood in line and called to tears. The end was over, everyone was in the same hall. The school children stood and were indignant. The players' exam? What does this have to do with them? Isn't it for 19-year-olds? They can't participate this year anyway. Go Taewook said that it shouldn't be like this, they think, but it does have to do with them. That's why he was here to give advice. Not long ago, an unexpected event occurred, a gate breach. Due to the risky increase in the number of monsters and dungeons, their player association admits that they are short of personnel. So, starting this year, he plans to allow high school students to receive recommendations as well. All the high school students started to be surprised and shout, "Why only a high school student? Them too?" He said that the recommendation for each school includes checking aptitude, grades, and behavior. They plan to select people based on the complete numerical data. Ten-hyun thought that this was a lie. This is an exam. It is true that high school students can take it, but the selection itself is already underway. This is Go Taewook's skill of determining with the gaze of an observer. The gaze of an observer is the ability to quantify the total number of abilities of the person you are looking at, even to see the information of the player's status window when concentrating. He stood confidently behind the podium and continued speaking. He thought that the number here is definitely better than other places. They will become great players. But among them, the most surprising thing is these two. Lee, who had the number 1924 hanging over his head. Lim Young, who had the number 2335 hanging above her head. He had received a list of recommended targets from the Night Wanderers, but such numbers for an unprepared awakened. He would have to write a letter of recommendation once he returned to the association. Lee confidently raised his hand and asked him a question. Go Taewook looked at him in confusion. He asked what he said about providing recommendations for the player exam. Were there any who did not qualify for the position at all? He asked unsuitable candidates? He moved his fingers and said that the exam was a test to determine whether any awakened had the right to become a player. So he believed that there was no need for non-awakened people to listen to this. He glared at the protagonist. A player is not only his strength. Of course, the rank of the awakened Nova, the ability to handle various situations, the vast knowledge of the abyss, all these difficult ways must be tested in order to gain the right to become a player. Lee mockingly said that the first difficulty is awakening. If non-awakened people listen to this, will they not suffer? The students started to make fun of the unawakened one. Ten-hyun looked at him and thought that he was giving such a speech, he wanted to test if he was awakened? Lee gloated. You thought, if he was awakened, then he should quickly prove it. Lim A-Yun turned to him and shouted at him to stop doing all this. Ten-hyun stood there with a stony face and asked what she was doing? Did he ask her to help? She was very surprised by this and turned away. She thought that she should not care. Lee said that he hoped that he would be pulled out of here as soon as possible. He laughed and listened. Go Taewook said that he understood what the student was talking about, but attending this lecture was up to them. Lee turned back to the protagonist and asked if he was ashamed. He still wouldn't be able to get a recommendation as an awakened one, right? Or is he saying that he doesn't care about things like player exams at all? Ten-hyun smiled and thought, is that possible? If someone can't clearly prove that they are awakened, they won't have a chance to pass the exam. But he doesn't have to prove it in person to get a recommendation. Because the deputy was watching all the students with his skill at that moment, he noticed 3 students who stood out from the crowd. Go Taewook was very surprised and thought that although Lee was a C-rank, he was just a hooligan. How pitiful. And this one, his name is Ten-hyun? According to the students, he is not awakened, and his potential level is unknown. He felt sorry for the awakened ones. He tried to concentrate on him, but a system window popped up in front of him, saying that the information could not be confirmed. He was very surprised by this. Ten-hyun said that he was right, he was very stupid. Lee turned to the side and was very surprised by his words. He asked what use it was for an unawakened person to listen to such information. It would only hurt his pride in vain. He asked what he was talking about. He said that's why he's leaving. He showed him the middle finger on his hand. Lee glared at him and said that he stayed and listened to a great lecture. He's an idiot. He's annoying him until the very end. Go Taiwook started to panic and thought that his observer's gaze didn't work. Neither the association president nor the guild leader Yu Yang. This has never happened to him before. Then how? On this brat? At the same time, Tenhyun started to walk out of that hall while everyone was looking at him. Go Taiwook looked at the protagonist with bulging eyes because he couldn't confirm the information he needed. He started to pack hard. But after some time of his attempts, he saw the number 5096 above his head and was shocked by it. Some time later, when the school and the courtyard were empty, the corridors were filled with rays of sunlight. Tenhyun was sitting in the empty library and leafing through the books he placed next to him.